Hello, my friend. Welcome back. I am so glad you are here, safe and warm, wherever you are lying down tonight. Tonight, I have a very gentle story to keep you company, a story you do not need to follow closely. Let it simply wash over you, like a slow river, like a tide coming in. Before we begin, let yourself settle a little more deeply into wherever you are. Feel the weight of your body, feel the softness beneath you. Take one slow breath in, hold it gently, and let it go. You are safe. The day is done. Our story tonight comes from a very long time ago, from a place so far at the edge of the known world that the map simply stopped, and beyond the last ink, there was only wind, and rain, and stone. There was a small outpost, a mile castle, the Romans called it, a little fortress built into the great wall, manned by a handful of men, far from the nearest town, far from home. And those men waited, day after day, season after season. They waited for orders that never quite came. And in that waiting, something very quiet and very beautiful took hold. This is their story, not a story of battles or victories, just a story of stone walls and cold mornings and fires lit before dawn. A story of ordinary days lived at the very edge of the world. Let yourself breathe with the story. There is nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to understand. Just let the words carry you, softly, towards sleep. You can close your eyes now, if you like. I will keep talking, softly, for a long while. You do not need to stay awake. The wall is waiting for you. The fire is already lit. The night watch has begun, and all is well. All is safe. Come, let us go back to the edge of the world, where the wind is gentle tonight, and the stones are warm. Let the story begin. There is a place in the north of the island of Britain, where the land rises and falls in long, slow waves of moorland, where the heather in summer turns a shade of purple so soft it looks like a bruise left by the sky. The Romans called this island Britannia, and they came to it with their roads and their straight lines and their stubborn conviction that the world could be ordered, measured, and held. They built towns, they built temples, they built baths where men could wash away the mud of the northern winter and imagine, for a warm half hour, that they were somewhere else entirely. But the North was different. The North did not yield to straight lines as easily. It had its own geometry, a slow, rolling geometry of ridges and valleys and wide skies that seemed to press down rather than lift up. Skies the color of pewter and chalk, and, on certain evenings, a very pale and watery gold. The Romans came north anyway. They always did. They were, above all things, a people who believed in pushing until they found a wall. And in the north of Britain, they eventually built one. The wall stretched from sea to sea, from the Solway Firth in the west to the mouth of the River Tyne in the east, across the narrow waste of the island. It was built of stone quarried from the landscape itself, the same gray limestone that lay just beneath the skin of the moors, fitted together by men who worked in all weathers and left no account of their feelings about the task. The wall was wide enough for two men to walk abreast along its top. It was tall enough that a man standing at its base could not see over it, and a man standing on its ramparts could see, on a clear day, very far indeed into the rolling country to the north. Along the wall, at intervals of roughly 1 Roman mile, the builders set small fortified gatehouses into the structure itself. The Romans had a simple name for them. They called them mile castles. Each one was a compact square of stone, perhaps 25 paces by 20 paces, with a gate on the northern face that opened out toward the wild country, and a gate on the southern face that opened back toward civilization. Inside, there was a barrack building, a small courtyard, and a cooking area. There was space for perhaps 8 to 12 men to sleep, to eat, to keep their equipment, and to wait. And waiting was, in large part, what they did. The men stationed in these small outposts were not the famous legionaries of Rome, the citizens who marched beneath the eagle standards and whose names fill the histories. They were auxiliaries, soldiers recruited from the provinces of the empire, men from Gaul and from the low coastal lands of what we now call the Netherlands, men from the Rhineland and from North Africa, and, in one remarkable case, a unit of Syrian archers who found themselves standing on a windswept northern British hilltop in their felt caps, looking out at a landscape that must have seemed to them like the surface of some very cold and very distant moon. They had signed on for a term of 25 years of service. At the end, they would receive Roman citizenship and a discharge bonus. In between, they would stand where they were told and do what they were told and write letters home asking, among other things, for warmer socks. We know they wrote these letters because some of those letters survived. At a fort called Vindolanda, a little to the south of the wall itself, archaeologists found hundreds of thin wooden writing tablets, small as postcards, covered in neat Latin script. They had been buried in layers of dark, airless soil for nearly 2,000 years, and they were extraordinarily well preserved. The tablets contained duty rosters and supply requests and official dispatches and, most movingly, personal letters. A soldier wrote to his mother. A woman wrote to a friend, inviting her to a birthday gathering. Someone complained about the quality of the local beer. Someone else asked for more socks and more underpants. Specifically, these small human details drift through the centuries like smoke through stone, and they remind us that the men on the wall were not abstractions. They were cold, and sometimes bored, and sometimes homesick, and they wanted their socks. They ate porridge in the mornings, and something that may have been a form of stew in the evenings, supplemented by whatever the local farmers could supply, or whatever a man could find in the streams and fields nearby. They drank wine when it arrived by supply cart, and local beer when it did not, and water from the springs that ran clean and cold out of the limestone all year long. The world they looked out at from their ramparts was not an enemy landscape, exactly. It was simply a landscape that had not been mapped, had not been taxed, had not been reorganized according to the Roman plan. To the north, beyond the wall, there were people. There were farmers and herders and small communities living in the long tradition of the island, people who had their own sense of time and their own sense of order, and who regarded the wall from their side with what was probably a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and pragmatic accommodation. Trade happened across the wall. Goods moved through the gate. People moved through the gate on legitimate errands, with passes and permissions. The frontier was never a simple line. The Mile Castle sat on a long ridge, as so many of them did, placed there by engineers who understood that high ground was watching ground, that a man standing on a ridge could see far, and that seeing far was, in the end, the whole point of the exercise. From the rampart walk on the northern face, you could look out across miles of open country, the land falling away in broad shelves of grass and bracken, small streams catching the light in the middle distance, and beyond them, the hills folding back into one another in gentle waves until they dissolved into the sky. On most days, there was nothing to see. This was the ordinary condition of the place. The country to the north was simply the country to the north, going about its business in the slow way that wild country does, oblivious to the man on the wall who was watching it with a mixture of professional alertness and personal boredom. The seasons announced themselves in their own way and in their own time, and the men of the Mile Castle learned to read them the way a person learns to read the face of someone they have lived with for a long time. The spring came first as a smell, a loosening in the air after the long compression of winter, something green and wet and slightly startling. The smell of the earth beginning to remember that it could be soft. Then the light changed, coming back a little earlier each morning, and the sky that had been sealed for months began to open, just slightly, just enough to let a different quality of brightness through. In summer, the moor was briefly, almost embarrassingly beautiful. The heather flowered and the light came in long, level sheets in the evening, turning the landscape gold and amber and a deep warm russet that made the stone of the wall seem to glow from within. The wind dropped on some evenings to almost nothing, and the silence that came in then was the kind of silence that has weight and presence. The silence of a very large and very old place being entirely itself. Insects moved through the air above the heather, and the birds that lived on the moor, the larks and the curlews and the small brown things whose names the soldiers from Gaul and the Rhineland did not know, called to one another across the wide sky in voices that seemed made entirely of space and light. The men would eat their evening meal on such nights with the south gate open and the warm air coming through, and someone might play a flute, or a set of pipes, or something stringed and plaintive that carried the memory of a different landscape, a warmer one, where the summers lasted longer and the wine grew on the hillside, outside the door. Music moves through walls as easily as water moves through stone, given enough time. The men of the auxiliaries brought their music with them from every corner of the empire, and it mixed and changed and became something new here on the northern edge, something that belonged to no homeland in particular, and to this particular sky in a way that nothing from anywhere else quite did. The autumn came slowly and with great dignity. The bracken turned from green to gold, to a deep, dark amber brown, and the light began its retreat earlier each evening, pulling back from the landscape the way a tide pulls back from a shore, leaving the moorland exposed and a little melancholy in the gray afternoons. The supply carts came up from the south before the worst of the season, loaded with grain and dried goods and clay amphoras of olive oil and occasionally, if the logistics had worked out, a small barrel of something better than the local beer. The men inventoried what they had and planned accordingly, because winter on the wall was a thing that required planning. And then the winter came. Not all at once, but in stages, each one a little more serious than the last. First the frosts, which arrived in the night and silvered every stone and every blade of grass by morning, leaving a landscape that looked as though it had been visited by something that touched everything lightly and left everything changed. Then the longer cold, the cold that settled into the stones of the wall itself and stayed there, radiating back outward at night in a way that was somehow worse than the cold of the open air. The men piled their cloaks and their blankets, and they kept the small hearth burning in the barrack room, and they told each other things, stories and jokes and remembrances of warmer places, and they waited for the darkness to be shorter and the light to come back again. They rotated the watch in 4-hour shifts, as Roman military regulations required, each man taking his turn on the rampart or at the gate, standing with his cloak pulled close and his eyes on the northern country. The duty roster was kept on a wooden tablet, updated each day by whoever held the role of optio, the second in command of the Mile Castle garrison, a title that meant something between a sergeant and an administrator and a keeper of accounts. The optio wrote down who was on duty and when, who was sick and what they were sick with, how much grain was left in the store, and what had passed through the gate that day, if anything had passed through at all. Most days, the report would have been brief, a few lines. A farmer with sheep, a message carrier from the next fort to the east, pausing to water his horse and exchange a few words. Nothing remarkable, nothing requiring action. The machinery of Roman frontier administration generated a great deal of paperwork for very quiet days. The men who lived here came from a wide scatter of the empire's provinces, and this was entirely by design. The Romans did not, as a rule, station auxiliary units in the provinces they came from. They sent the Batavians from the Rhine Delta to Britain, and they sent men from Britain to the Rhine, and men from other places to other places entirely, creating a frontier force that was thoroughly mixed, that had no local loyalties to the territory it guarded, that belonged only to Rome. It was a very deliberate kind of loneliness, built into the system from the beginning, and yet the men made a life. They always do. The tablets from Vindolanda tell us, in their small handwritten voices, that the life they made was ordinary in the most human of ways. They worried about their health. They worried about their families at home. They worried about whether the winter supplies would arrive before the first serious snow. They celebrated when good news came, or when the wine was better than expected, or when a friend turned up unexpectedly from the next fort along the road. They had opinions about the weather, which was, by the standards of most places these men had known before, genuinely unusual. The north of Britain in the 2nd century was, as one tablet put it, a place where the roads were often impassable, and the climate could only be described, politely, as very much itself. A unit of Batavians, men from the flat, waterlogged coastal lands of what is now the Netherlands and Belgium, served at Vindolanda in the early years of the 2nd century. They were cavalrymen by training and tradition, and they found themselves in a landscape that was at least partly familiar in its flatness and its damp. They built the fort up, they expanded the bathhouse, they wrote letters home and received letters in return, and we have both sides of some of those conversations, carried across the sea and the long roads of the empire, and then lost for 2,000 years in the cool, dark earth, and then found again, still legible, still personal, still carrying the particular weight of words written by one person to another person. They missed. One of the most famous of all the Vindolanda tablets is a letter from a woman named Claudia Severa to a woman named Sulpicia Lepidina, the wife of the fort commander. It is a birthday invitation. Claudia Severa asks Sulpicia Lepidina to come and celebrate with her, and she adds, at the end, a few words in her own handwriting, distinct from the rest of the letter, which was written by a scribe. Those few words are among the earliest examples of a woman's handwriting in the Latin world. They say, "I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper, and hail." Sister, dearest soul. The endearments cross the centuries without any loss of warmth, and they remind us that the frontier was not only a military installation, it was also a place where people lived and loved and marked the ordinary occasions of a human life with the ordinary rituals of care. The birthday party was held, or not held, if the roads were bad. Either way, the invitation exists, pressed into a thin wooden tablet, and it has outlasted the fort and the wall, and the empire that built both. There was a man, let us call him a man from the Rhineland, because that is what the historical record most often gives us for the garrisons of the British wall. A man from the Rhineland, assigned to a mile castle somewhere in the middle section of the wall, where the ridge is highest, and the views longest, and the wind most persistent. He has been in Britain for 7 years. He has another 18 to go before his discharge bonus and his citizenship papers, and the small plot of land he has been told will be waiting for him somewhere, in some province he may never have seen, assuming the administrative processes of the Roman army manage, eventually, to deliver on the promises they have been making. He is not unhappy. This is important. The instinct, looking back at his life, from our distance, is to frame it as a kind of hardship, a story of a man trapped far from home in a cold and inhospitable place. But that is our projection, not his experience. He has adapted. The cold that seemed cruel in his first winter is now simply the cold, a thing to be managed with appropriate clothing and a good fire, and the knowledge that it will pass. The landscape that seemed alien in his first spring is now his landscape, the one he knows, the one whose moods and rhythms he can read without thinking. He knows where the best spring water comes up through the limestone. He knows which direction the clouds come from that bring real rain, and which direction brings only mist, and which direction brings nothing but that particular gray light that is neither darkness nor brightness, simply the north sky being the north sky. He knows that the larks begin to sing before any other sign of dawn, and he has come, without quite deciding to time his waking to their first calls, so that when the lark rises from the heather and begins its long, spiraling song above the wall, his eyes are already open, and he is already thinking about the fire. He has learned some words in the language of the local people, the Brigantes and the other tribes whose territory bordered the wall on both sides. Not many words, but enough to conduct the transactions of daily frontier life. The purchase of grain, the negotiation over sheep that had wandered through the gate without their owner, the polite acknowledgement of the old farmer who came every month with a cart of vegetables, and who had been coming every month with a cart of vegetables since long before this particular man was posted here, and who would, in all probability, continue coming long after he was gone. The local people were, in his experience, neither the fearsome barbarians of official Roman imagination, nor the romanticized noble savages of later historical fantasy. They were, like him, people with lives and routines and concerns and occasional small pleasures. They grew things and traded things and visited their neighbors and told stories about the past. And the wall was, from their perspective, a fact of the landscape, in much the same way that the ridge it stood on was a fact of the landscape. Something to navigate, something to accommodate, not entirely welcome, but not entirely unwelcome either, given what came through the south gate by way of trade. On certain evenings, when the light was right and the day had been a good one, he would climb to the rampart walk and stand there for a while after his duty was done, not as a soldier on watch, but simply as a man standing at a high place at the end of the day, looking out at the country. The land to the north would be settling into its evening colors, the greens going dark and the heather going to deep purple, and the sky going through its slow exhibition of golds and grays, and occasionally, if he was lucky, that clear, cold green that sometimes appeared above the northern horizon, just at the last moment of twilight, a color that existed nowhere else and that he had never once managed to describe to anyone who had not seen it for themselves. He would stand there until the cold made itself known in his hands, and then he would go back down to the fire. Autumn came to the Mile Castle the way it always came to high places, early and without apology. The heather had already gone over by the time the first true cold settled in, and the moor took on the amber and rust colors of the dying season, colors that were beautiful in their own serious way. A beauty without warmth in it, a beauty that reminded you of what was coming. The bracken turned slowly from yellow to brown to the dark, wet brown of decay, and it lay flat against the hillsides in wind-swept layers, and the wind, which had been blowing all year in various intensities from various directions, took on in autumn a particular quality, a steadiness and a coldness that made it different from the summer wind even when it blew from the same direction and at the same speed. The supply convoy came up from the south in late autumn before the passes could ice over. The men of the Mile Castle heard it before they saw it, the sound of iron-shod wheels on the stone road and the low voices of the muleteers carrying up from the valley below. They came out of the gate to watch its arrival, not because there was anything to do to help. The convoy had its own staff and its own routines, but because the arrival of the convoy was an event, one of the few events of the season that could not be anticipated on any particular day, only expected within a general window of weeks. And the uncertainty was, in its own small way, a form of excitement. The goods that came were practical and unremarkable, grain mainly, and salt fish in clay jars, and olive oil that had traveled a very long way from somewhere warm to arrive in this cold stone room, smelling of the south and the sun. There was leather for mending boots and harness, and nails and tools, and occasionally medical supplies for the small infirmary kept at the nearest fort to the east. And sometimes, in the bottom of one cart or another, something personal, a package addressed to one of the men by name, from someone who had gone to the trouble of sending something across the sea and the long roads of the empire to this small square of stone on a northern ridge. Those packages were opened privately, in the barrack room, away from the eyes of the others, which was a courtesy that the men extended to one another without needing to discuss it. Whatever was inside, whether it was practical, food or clothing, or medicine, or personal, a letter, a small object of no particular value but great particular meaning, belonged to the man who received it in a way that deserved a moment of private possession before it became part of the shared life of the garrison. The men wrote back, when they could. They wrote on thin wooden tablets with iron styluses, the same as the famous letters found at Vindolanda, pressing their words into the wood in a clear Roman hand. They wrote about practical things, about their health, about what they needed, about what they had received. And sometimes they wrote about the place itself, about the view from the wall in the morning, about the color of the sky at a certain time of day, about the sound of the wind across the heather, as if the place were worth describing, as if the person reading at the other end of that long road might want to know what the world looked like from here. Perhaps they did want to know. Perhaps the letters traveled back and found readers who sat with them in warm rooms, in warmer latitudes, and read about the long northern light with something that was not quite envy and not quite pity, but something in between, something like the feeling of standing at the door of a familiar place and looking out at weather. You are glad, in that moment, not to be in, but which has its own undeniable presence, its own undeniable beauty, the kind of beauty that does not ask you to be comfortable, only to pay attention. The nights grew longer. The garrison ate their evening meal earlier, pulling closer to the fire as the darkness came in, and the conversation in the barrack room became, in the way of all conversation in cold, dark places, quieter and more reflective. The talk of men who were not going anywhere, who were simply here, in this place, together, and who had slowly come to find that fact sufficient. The winter solstice was not a day marked in any grand way at the Mile Castle. There was no particular ceremony that the official Roman calendar required, though the men may have marked it in the small private ways of people who are paying attention to the light, noting its return, welcoming the fact that, from this day onward, each day would be a fraction longer than the one before it, until the balance tipped again toward warmth and brightness, and the possibility of something growing. The fire in the barrack room was the center of everything in winter. It was not a large fire, the hearth was small, and the fuel was carefully rationed, but it was enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay, and to make the room habitable in a way that the Romans, who were a people of fires and furnaces and underfloor heating in their larger establishments, understood viscerally. The fire was warmth and light and company, a point of focus for eyes that had nothing else to look at in the long winter evenings except the faces of the men around it and the shadow play on the stone walls. They told stories by that fire. This is not something recorded in any tablet we have found, but it requires no great imaginative leap to conclude that men sitting around fires in the long dark evenings told stories, because all people sitting around fires in long dark evenings tell stories. It is among the most ancient and most human of occupations, the oldest technology for making the darkness smaller, and the company feel larger, and the night feel safer than it would if you were sitting in silence listening to the wind. What stories did they tell? We can only guess, and the guesses are interesting. Men from the Rhineland would have brought stories from the Rhine, stories of the river and the forests and the particular deities of those places, the local gods who had been incorporated into the Roman pantheon with the pragmatic religious flexibility that was one of Rome's most useful political tools. Men from Gaul would have brought Gallic stories, and men from North Africa would have brought stories from an entirely different landscape, desert stories, warm stories, stories that must have seemed almost unimaginable in a barrack room in a northern British winter. The stories would have mixed. That is what stories do when they are put in close proximity for long enough. They borrow from each other and blend and produce new things that belong to no single tradition. The Mile Castle, like every other small human place on every frontier throughout history, was a place where the world was quietly, unremarkably remixed, where the edges of things met and rubbed against each other, and eventually, over years and decades, produced something that was its own thing, belonging to the wall and to the men who had lived on it. The winter solstice passed. The days began to lengthen. It was not noticeable at first. The change was too small for any single day to register as different. But over a week, and then 2 weeks, and then a month, the change accumulated, and one morning a man woke up and noticed that there was light in the sky before the watch change. Thin and pale, and not yet warm, but light, unmistakably light. And he felt something shift in his chest, some small, uncelebrated relief that the long dark was ending, that the world was, once again, turning toward the sun. The larks began again, not all at once, but one by one, first the most impatient ones, who started while the cold was still sharp and the wind still had its winter quality, and then more of them, until the morning above the wall was full of that rising, spiraling song, that sound of something very small ascending into a very large sky with absolute conviction that the effort was worthwhile. The man from the Rhineland, who had been on the wall for 8 years now and had learned to time his waking to their first calls, heard them and lay still for a moment longer in the warmth of his blankets, listening. The rhythm of a day at the Mile Castle was repetitive by design. Roman military culture was, at its heart, a culture of routine, of the systematic and repeatable. of the small daily acts that accumulate into discipline and discipline into something that can be relied upon over long periods and in difficult circumstances. The watch rotated every 4 hours. The meals came at the same time each day. The equipment was inspected and maintained on a schedule. The gate was opened at dawn and closed at dusk, unless circumstances required otherwise. And circumstances, at this particular mile castle on this particular ridge in this particular season, rarely required otherwise. Before the gate was opened each morning, the duty soldiers walked the rampart walk in the still gray light before dawn, checking the wall to the east and west, looking out at the northern country, making note of anything that was different from the day before. On most mornings, nothing was different from the day before. The country to the north was the country to the north, going about its business as it always had. A few deer, sometimes, moving through the bracken below the wall. A fox on the ridge to the northeast, pausing at the crest, looking back toward the wall with its bright, interested eye before descending the far side and disappearing. Birds, always birds, the curlews especially, whose long liquid call was the sound of the moor in all seasons and all weathers. After the patrol, there was the cooking fire, built up from the banked embers of the night fire, porridge, mainly, and flatbread cooked on a flat stone, and whatever had come in the previous day's forage or purchase. The Romans were good provisioners, and the wall was well supplied by the standards of its time. But provisioning at a small mile castle in the interior could not always keep pace with the full range of ingredients that a Roman cook would have preferred. The men improvised. They learned to use what the northern landscape offered: herbs that grew wild on the moor, mushrooms in season, fish from the streams, meat when hunting was possible on authorized days. The diet that emerged from these improvisations was a hybrid thing, neither fully Roman nor fully local, a frontier cuisine that belonged to the wall the way everything eventually came to belong to the wall. After breakfast, the day's work. There was always work. Roman military life did not permit idleness, not because idleness was considered a moral failing, though it was, but because the maintenance of a stone fortification in a northern climate was a continuous and absorbing occupation. The frost worked at the mortar, the rain worked at the joints, the wind worked at everything. Every spring there was damage to assess and repair. Every autumn there was sealing and shoring against the winter to come. There were weapons to sharpen and armor to oil, and harness to mend and records to write, and dispatches to carry and receive, and, at least once a week, the full formal inspection that required everything to be laid out in its precise regulation configuration and checked against the official list. None of this was glamorous. None of it was the kind of thing that would find its way into official histories or triumphal inscriptions. It was the work of keeping a small piece of the empire functioning, and it was done by men who understood, most of the time without resentment and without particular ambition, that this was what they were here for. The empire was held together by 10,000 such small acts of maintenance, repeated every day, in every weather, at every outpost along every frontier from the British moors to the edge of the Sahara. In the middle of the day, when the light was at its best and the wind sometimes dropped to something manageable, some of the off-duty men would go outside the south gate and find a sheltered spot on the slope below the wall, out of the wind, in whatever sun there was. And they would sit there for a while doing nothing in particular, mending, perhaps, or just sitting. The Romans had a word for this kind of pause. They had words for most things. The off-duty hours were understood to belong to the man, to be used as he saw fit. And what some men saw fit was simply to sit in the sun, if the sun was available, and let the mind rest from the weight of routine. Water was a constant consideration in the life of the mile castle. The wall was built, when it could be, along ridge lines, and the springs that came up through the limestone along those ridges were numerous and reliable. A mile castle that had no certain water source was a mile castle that could not function, and the engineers who planned the wall knew this and accounted for it. The men who lived in the mile castle knew where their nearest spring was, the way a person knows where their kitchen is, automatically, by the body's knowledge rather than conscious thought. In summer, the spring ran fast and cold and clean, and the water tasted of the limestone it had passed through, a clean mineral taste that was different from any water these men had known before, and that they came, over time, to associate with the particular satisfaction of arriving back at the Mile Castle after a long patrol on a warm day, and drinking deeply from the stone trough where the spring collected before running off southward toward the valley. In winter, the spring ran more slowly, and there were days when the trough had a skim of ice on it in the morning that had to be broken before the water could be drawn. This was a small task, the breaking of ice, a thing done with a stick or an elbow, requiring 30 seconds at most, but it was one of those small daily tasks that carries the whole weight of a season in it. The confirmation each morning that yes, winter is still here. Yes, the world is still cold. Yes, we are still on the northern edge of everything. The men bathed when they could. The nearest proper bathhouse was at the fort to the east, and they went there periodically, on rotation, because the bath was not only hygiene but morale. The deep, pleasurable heat of the caldarium after a week of cold stone and cold water. The conversation in the steam room with men from the next fort and the next. The catching up of news and gossip, and the small social transactions that kept a person connected to something larger than the 8 men of the Mile Castle and the half-mile of wall they were responsible for. The walk to the bathhouse was itself a pleasure, 3 miles along the road that ran behind the wall, the road good and well maintained, the country on the south side of the wall more settled and less wild, with small farms and occasional larger civilian settlements growing up in the protection of the military infrastructure. The walk took an hour at a comfortable pace, and it offered a kind of reacquaintance with the world, a reminder that the Mile Castle was not the whole of things, that the road ran in both directions, that the empire was a large and various place even at its very edge. They came back from the bathhouse in the afternoons, cleaner and warmer, and carrying any news or letters or small luxuries that had been available at the fort's small market. They came back through the south gate, and the gatekeeper noted their return, and the Mile Castle absorbed them again, as quietly and completely as a small stone building absorbs the men who live in it, until the place smelled of them and their gear and their cooking, until the stones of the walls held, in some sense that is not literal, but not entirely metaphorical either, some residual warmth of their presence. The afternoon light came through the south-facing windows of the barrack room and lay in long strips on the stone floor, and the men moved in and out of those strips of light as they went about the business of the afternoon. And for an hour or two there was a quality of ease in the room, a slowing down that was neither sleep nor wakefulness, but something between, the particular restfulness of a body that has done its work and knows it, that has earned the afternoon light and is now receiving it, with the uncomplicated gratitude of the well-used and the satisfied. The gate was the reason for everything. The Mile Castle existed to control passage through the wall, and the North Gate, the one that opened onto the wild country, was its essential feature, the thing that justified the garrison, the pay, the supply convoys, the duty rosters, the whole elaborate machinery of the Roman frontier administration. In practice, the gate was rarely dramatic. The people who came through it for ordinary reasons. They came to trade, bringing hides and wool and cattle and whatever else the local economy produced that found buyers in the Roman South. They came to seek work, because the military presence generated a civilian economy, and that economy needed labor of various kinds. They came to visit relatives, because the wall ran through the middle of communities that had been there long before it was built, and that maintained their own social connections, regardless of what the political situation required. A man from the north with family in the south would make his way to the Mile Castle gate with his pass or his explanation and his legitimate purpose. And most of the time, after the required transaction of identity and purpose, and sometimes a small fee, he would come through. The soldiers at the gate were not, by all accounts, enthusiastic or aggressive in the exercise of their authority. The tablets from Vindolanda record a complaint from a merchant who felt he had been treated contemptuously by the garrison at a checkpoint. They also record the garrison's perspective, which was that the merchant was being difficult. Both perspectives feel recognizable across the centuries. Bureaucracy generates friction. The people who administer it do so with varying degrees of grace and competence. The people who must navigate it do so with varying degrees of patience and charm. This has been true of every frontier and every checkpoint and every gate in human history. And the Mile Castle was no different. But there were also moments at the gate that were not transactions, moments that belonged to no category in the official records. A farmer from the north, older, someone who had been coming through this particular gate for years, would stop for a moment longer than strictly necessary, resting his weight against the gate frame, looking back at his own country with an expression that the duty soldier, if he was paying attention, might have recognized as the expression of a person taking stock. Not saying goodbye, exactly, not making a farewell, simply looking for a moment at the thing he was leaving, holding it in his eyes before turning south. Those moments did not go in the duty log. They were not reportable. They belonged to the category of things that happen between the official records, in the spaces where the administration does not reach, and the human proceeds according to its own logic. The soldier at the gate saw them, and noted them, and said nothing, and let them pass. And the farmer passed through, and the gate closed, and the country to the north was the country to the north again, looking exactly as it always had. On certain nights, when the wind was from the north, and the sky was clear, sounds came through the wall from the northern country. Not alarming sounds, nothing that would rouse the watch. Just sounds of the country at night. The bark of a dog somewhere in the distance. The call of an owl. The sound of a fire that someone was sitting next to on the other side of the ridge, doing, in all probability, exactly what the men of the Mile Castle were doing, sitting by a fire in the dark, waiting for morning. The wall, from this angle, in these moments, was not quite the sharp division it was meant to be. It was a line, certainly, a line of stone and authority and imperial administration, but sound crossed it, and smell crossed it, and weather crossed it, and, in the end, time crossed it, patient and absolute, leaving no section of wall unaffected. There was a specific hour, in the deep middle of the night, that the men of the Mile Castle came to know the way you come to know the particular silence of a house you have lived in for years, by its character rather than by any measurable quality. It was the hour after the second watch change, and before the first hint of dawn, the deepest hour of the darkness, when the fire was at its lowest and the wind outside had usually settled to something quiet and steady, and the world seemed most completely itself, most entirely what it was, without the daytime overlay of activity and purpose. In that hour, whoever was on watch was very much alone. The others slept. The Mile Castle was quiet in the way that stone buildings are quiet in the deep night, which is not quite silence but something older than silence. The absence of the sounds of life, the settling of the stone itself, the occasional movement of some creature in the darkness outside who was going about its own night without any reference to the men inside the wall. The watch soldier would stand on the rampart walk or sit in the gatehouse, depending on the weather and his own inclination, and he would look out at the northern country in the dark, and he would think whatever he thought. And we cannot know what that was, because thinking is not the kind of thing that finds its way into tablets and records, but we can guess that it was the thinking of a person alone in a large, quiet place. The thinking that happens when there is no immediate task, no conversation, no demand of any kind, just a person, and the darkness, and the long patience of the stone around them. The stars, on clear nights, were extraordinary. The north of Britain, far from any settlement large enough to produce significant light, offered a sky that has since been mostly lost to the lit and crowded south. A sky so thick with stars that the individual constellations were harder to find. Not easier, because the stars were too many, too densely packed, the familiar patterns obscured by the sheer abundance of the light that the darkness was holding. The soldiers knew the constellations that any Roman educated man knew. The bear, the hunter, the river. They would have navigated by them on night marches, used them for telling the time in the pre-dawn hours before the first light arrived. But on nights when there was no marching and no navigating, when the watch was simply the watch, and the stars were simply the stars, the sky above the Mile Castle was something else again. It was a spectacle, and a companion, and a reminder of scale, a sky that made the Mile Castle very small, and the men very small, and the wall very small, without making any of those things less significant, only more appropriately sized, more honestly proportioned against the actual dimensions of the world. The fire inside was low, the sleeping men breathed, the northern country was quiet, the stars moved in their slow and reliable way from east to west. The watch soldier pulled his cloak a little closer and thought his thoughts, and kept his eyes on the darkness. And the darkness offered nothing back except itself, which was, in truth, more than enough. The supply convoy that came in the middle of autumn was not only grain and oil and leather, it was also information. It brought news from the south in the form of dispatches and official communications, and when the administrative chain had functioned as intended, personal mail. The anticipation of the mail was a specific kind of feeling that the men of the Mile Castle knew well. The feeling of waiting for something that might or might not arrive, that might or might not contain what you hoped it would contain, a feeling that combined hope and resignation, in proportions that shifted depending on how long it had been since the last delivery. Some men received mail regularly. They had someone at the other end of the long road who wrote faithfully and sent things and kept the connection alive across the distance and the time. Those men were lucky, in a way that was understood and not resented, only perhaps quietly envied. Their reading of their letters was done privately, as was the custom. But the effect was public, visible in a particular ease that settled over a man for a day or two after a good letter, a warmth in his manner, a willingness to laugh more readily, a quality of having been briefly reminded that he was, somewhere beyond the wall in the duty roster, a person with people who thought of him. Other men received mail rarely, or not at all, not because they were forgotten or unloved, necessarily, but because the supply chains of human affection are as subject to disruption as any other supply chain. Someone at the other end of the road was ill, or was overwhelmed with the demands of their own life, or had moved and the new address had not arrived through the proper channels, or had written and the letter had been lost somewhere along the 300 miles of road, and sea and road between there and here. The official Roman postal system was efficient by the standards of its time, but it was not infallible, and the distance between northern Britain and any of the homelands these men had come from was very considerable. A man who had not received a letter in a long time developed a philosophical relationship with the idea of a letter. He knew in the abstract that a letter was a thing that existed in the world, that other men received letters, that the system by which letters traveled was generally functional. He also knew, in the concrete experience of his own daily life, that for him, at this particular moment in this particular year, letters were theoretical. They were a category of thing, not a thing. He had learned to live with this, as he had learned to live with the cold and the isolation, and the 18 more years on his contract. He lived with it the way the wall itself lived with the weather. Not happily, exactly, not indifferently either, but steadily, stone by stone. The letters he wrote went into the system, and he did not know with certainty if they arrived. He hoped they did. He assumed they did, because the alternative, the image of his words dissolving somewhere on the road, unreceived, unread, was too bleak a thing to hold too steadily. He wrote anyway. He wrote about the weather, which was notable. He wrote about his health, which was adequate. He wrote about the landscape, which he had by now come to know deeply and well, and which he described sometimes with an accuracy and a care that surprised him, as if the act of trying to put the place into words for someone who had never seen it was teaching him something about how to see it. The wall had done that to him, among other things. It had made him look. There was very little else to look at, and the looking, sustained over years and seasons, had gone deep. He could tell, by the particular shade of the northern horizon at dusk, what the weather would be like the following morning, and he was right often enough that the others had come to ask him about it, casually, the way you ask someone for information they reliably hold. He had become, without quite intending to, an expert in this particular sky, this particular quarter of the world's atmosphere, as if the long watching had eventually yielded not information exactly, but something more like attunement, a resonance with the place that was not wisdom in any grand sense, but was, in its own modest way, a form of knowledge that belonged only here and could not be transferred. The orders that the Mile Castle waited for were not one single category of thing. Orders came in several forms and from several directions. There were the standing orders that formed the permanent framework of the garrison's existence, the watch schedule, the gate procedures, the maintenance requirements, the rules about what could and could not pass through in which direction. These were always there, always operative, forming the basic structure of the day. Then there were operational orders, which came by dispatch rider from the commanding fort and which covered matters of immediate military relevance, instructions to increase or decrease watch frequency, information about movement of persons of interest in the Northern Territory, changes to the supply schedule, the occasional request for a party of men to be sent to assist with a specific task at one of the larger forts. These came irregularly, and they were the nearest thing to events that the Mile Castle experienced on a regular basis. A dispatch rider arriving was a small punctuation in the ongoing sentence of routine, a comma or a period that briefly changed the rhythm. And then there were the larger orders, the ones that did not come from the nearest fort but from further away, from the provincial capital at Ibaracum, which we now call York, or from Rome itself via the slow machinery of imperial administration. These were the orders that would move units, that would change postings, that would bring new men or take existing men away to somewhere else. These were the orders that a man on a 25-year contract, in his 8th year on the northern wall, might have allowed himself, quietly and without too much emphasis, to hope for. A transfer, a different posting, a return southward. Those orders, at this particular Mile Castle, in this particular period, did not come. Or they came slowly, in the way that large administrative movements always come slowly, carrying with them the particular time lag of institutions that must balance 1,000 competing requirements before any single piece of it can shift. The men waited, as men have always waited for the decisions of institutions larger than themselves, with a mixture of patience and mild resignation, and the occasional private fantasy of elsewhere. But the waiting was not empty. This is the thing that is hardest to convey from this distance. The thing that the official records, with their focus on events and decisions, and the movement of troops, cannot easily capture. The waiting was full. It was full of the small daily life that the men had built in and around their routine. The accumulated texture of 8 years, or 12 years, or 20 years of mornings and evenings and meals and watches and conversations and letters and laughter, and the occasional surprising good day, and the more frequent unremarkable adequate day. The wall was, for the men who lived on it long enough, not simply a posting. It was a life. Their life. The one they had, which is always, in the end, the only one that fully belongs to a person. The grass grew in the cracks of the stone. The moss spread itself slowly across the north face where the rain ran down. The swallows came back every summer and nested under the eaves of the barrack building and left again in the autumn, and their going was a small annual grief of the kind that living in a place produces. And their return each spring was a small annual gladness of exactly the same kind. The wall endured, the men endured. The season turned and turned again, and the orders, when they came in the fullness of time. And in the waiting, without quite noticing, the men had learned the particular piece of a place that is content to simply be. The wall itself was the most constant presence in the lives of the men who lived on it. This is perhaps obvious, but it is easy to lose sight of what it meant in practice to live inside and on top of a large stone structure for years at a time. The stone was everywhere, underfoot on the paving of the Mile Castle courtyard, above and around in the walls of the barrack room, beneath the hands when you sat on the wall itself and looked out at the country. The stone had weight and texture and temperature, and you came to know it all. The limestone that the wall was built from was the same limestone that lay beneath the moor, the same stone that the springs ran through on their way to the surface. And it had a particular quality in different lights and different weathers. In summer, on a sunny day, the wall could be almost warm to the touch, having spent the long day absorbing whatever heat the northern sun managed to produce. In winter, the stone was cold in a way that seemed to go deeper than mere surface temperature, a cold that had been accumulating in the mass of the wall for months, that radiated outward like the negative of warmth. The men knocked on the wall sometimes. This is not recorded anywhere. But the impulse, for a person who lives in close proximity to a large stone structure, to tap it, to test it, to make it respond with its hollow or solid sound, seems inevitable. The wall sounded different in different places, different sections having been built by different working parties at different times, some sections denser than others, some with inclusions or gaps in the core that altered the resonance. A man who had lived on a section of wall long enough would know its sound the way he knew the sound of his own name. The wall was repaired regularly, and the repairs were documented in the few inscriptions that have survived on stone tablets set into sections of the wall itself. These inscriptions record the unit that did the repair, and sometimes the date, and sometimes the length of wall repaired. They are the most laconic of all the human traces on the wall, stripped down to the essential facts of the transaction. Who was here? What they did? When they did it? No adjectives, no feelings, just the unit and the work and the measurement. But the repairs themselves were not laconic. They required effort and time and skill. The repointing of joints, the replacement of stones that had cracked or shifted over winter, the clearing of debris from the drainage channels that ran beneath the wall to carry away the considerable rainfall of the northern British climate. It was the work of men who had learned to care for a specific piece of stone infrastructure with the particular care of people who live with the consequences of their maintenance or their failure to maintain. A section of wall that was properly repaired and drained stayed sound for generations. A section that was neglected let the water in, and the frost worked at it, and within a few years the damage was significant and the repair much greater. They took pride in their section of wall. This too is not recorded explicitly, but it follows from everything else we know about the Roman military culture of the frontier, which was a culture that valued the work of the hands as much as the decisions of the mind, that saw the maintained road and the repaired wall and the functioning gate as forms of excellence in their own right. To leave your section of wall in better condition than you found it, or at least no worse, was to have done what you were supposed to do. In a world of 25-year contracts and long distances from home, it was something to hold on to. The stone would outlast them all. They knew this, in the way that people who live close to old things always know it, without it being a disturbing thought exactly, more a background fact of the landscape. The wall had been here before them, and would be here after them. They were its temporary inhabitants, its caretakers for the duration, and the wall, for its part, held them in its mass, and its shadow, and its weight, and its long cold storage of the northern light, and sheltered them from the wind, and supported their feet on its rampart walk, and kept them, in the most literal sense, enclosed and safe within the stone. The sound of the wall and wind was a particular sound, not quite like any other. It was not simply the wind being interrupted by a surface. The way a building in a town interrupts the wind and creates eddies and whirls, and the familiar urban sound of wind trapped between structures. The wall on its open ridge intercepted the wind across its full height and its full length, and the wind went over the top and around the ends and through the occasional gap. And the combined effect was a low, complex sound that had harmonics in it, deeper and higher notes, woven together in a way that changed continuously as the wind shifted. The men learned to hear the wall and wind, the way you learn to hear the voice of a place that you have lived with for long enough. They heard which direction the wind was coming from by the particular quality of the wall's response. They heard the difference between a wind that would moderate and a wind that was building. On very quiet nights, when the wind dropped to almost nothing, the wall itself seemed to breathe, its thermal mass releasing or absorbing heat in a way that created the smallest of movements in the air close to the stone, something that was not quite sound, but that a person standing close to the wall in the deep night could feel as a kind of pulse. The wind was, in a sense, the wall's most constant visitor, more constant even than the men who garrisoned it, because the men changed and the wind did not. The same wind that had blown across these hills before the wall was built continued to blow across them after the wall was built, and it would continue after the wall was abandoned and the garrisons were withdrawn, and the stone began its long, slow return to the landscape. The wind was older than Rome. It was indifferent to Rome. It blew across the top of the wall with the same even consideration it extended to every other surface it encountered in its long journey across the northern country, and the wall accepted it, and the men accepted it, and the seasons turned. In the evenings, when the light was going and the fire inside was beginning to warm the stone of the barrack room, and the day was settling toward its end, there was often a particular quality of stillness outside the mile castle. A pause in the wind, as if the day were drawing breath before the full dark came. The men who were finishing their evening duties in those minutes, carrying water or banking the outdoor cooking fire, or making the last check of the gate fastenings, would notice this stillness without necessarily remarking on it, would feel it as a kind of gift the landscape offered without being asked, a moment of rest that belonged to no duty roster and no official purpose. In those moments, the North Country was very beautiful. The sky in the last light was layered, the horizon still faintly bright below a band of deep blue that darkened upward into the first stars, and the moor stretched out to the north in shades of gray and dark green, and the very last remnants of the day's amber, and the air smelled of cold stone and heather and the particular freshness that the north has at the end of a clear day, a smell of altitude and distance and the long, unhurried history of a place that has been weathered by millennia of exactly this kind of evening. The man finishing his task outside would pause for a moment, involuntarily, arrested by the stillness and the beauty, and he would stand there for a count of several breaths, not thinking anything particular, not remembering or anticipating, simply there, in the evening, in the north, in the small and certain fact of his own presence in this particular place at this particular time. And then the cold would remind him of itself, gently, as cold does, and he would go inside, and the gate would close, and the fire would be the center of the world for a little while longer, and the night would do what it always did, quietly, reliably, without drama, deepening from gray to black above the old stone wall. Spring on the northern moors did not announce itself with the optimistic speed of spring in the south. It came tentatively, retreating and returning several times before it committed to anything as definitive as warmth. There would be a week of something almost mild, mild enough that a man without his cloak for an hour in the middle of the day did not immediately regret it, and then the cold would return, firmer than before, as if spring had been a rumor rather than a fact. This happened several times, and the men who had spent years on the wall had learned not to trust the first signs, had learned to wait for the second or third confirmation before allowing themselves to feel the particular relief of a winter ending. But the signs were always true in the end. The grass began to come back first, the new growth very bright and thin among the dead stems of the previous year, green of the kind that exists only in early spring, before the season has had time to darken and toughen it. The hawthorn on the lower slopes put out its first tiny leaves, and then its blossom. And the blossom had a smell that carried very far on a clear day, a smell that was sweet without being heavy, a smell of something opening. The birds came back, the migratory ones, the ones that had been absent since the autumn, reappeared in ones and twos, and then in larger numbers, and their songs were new in the morning air after the limited winter repertoire of ravens and crows, and the hardy resident species that had stayed through the cold. The swallows arrived in late spring, and their arrival was always, for the men of the Mile Castle, a small event. They nested under the same eaves where they had nested the previous year, or where the previous year's swallows had nested. Generation after generation of birds returning to the same stone ledges and roof timbers without any apparent uncertainty about whether those ledges and timbers would still be there. The swallow's confidence in the permanence of the Mile Castle was, in its own way, reassuring. These small birds, who had made a round trip of thousands of miles since the last autumn, came back every year to the same stone building on the same ridge in the north of Britain, and they built their nests and raised their young and departed again, and in doing so they made the Mile Castle part of a larger pattern of returns and continuations, part of the migratory world, part of something that connected this stone outpost to warm African coasts and the wide sky of the ocean crossing and the long green valleys of the south, all without anyone having intended it or arranged it. The men watched the swallows with a particular kind of attention, not the attention of naturalists exactly, but the attention of people who share a space with other creatures and cannot help but notice them. They watch the nest building, the feeding of the young, the first flights of the fledglings, the gathering on the wall top before departure, hundreds of birds in August, sitting on the high places and calling to one another in their rapid, flowing voices, filling the air above the wall with a sound that was neither melancholy nor celebratory, but simply alive, intensely and fully alive in the way that things are that are about to undertake something very large and very uncertain. And then they went, and the wall was quieter, and the men who had watched them go went back to their duties and their meals and their watches, and the season continued its turn, and the days began their shortening, and the first cold came back from the north, and the cycle continued, as it had before these men arrived, as it would after they departed, the great slow wheel of the northern year turning above the stones of the wall, and the stones asking nothing of it except that it continue, which it always did. There were good days on the wall, days when everything in the ordinary routine was accomplished without difficulty, when the weather was decent, and the supply situation was adequate, and nobody was ill, and the correspondence had been dealt with, and the gate had seen its usual modest traffic, and the evening meal was better than average, and the wine was not bad. These days had no particular name and no marker in the records. They were simply adequate days that crossed the line into something you might call pleasant. And they were, in the long arithmetic of a posting, more common than dramatic days, which is both the saving grace of frontier life and the thing that makes it, from the outside, look uneventful. The men celebrated small things because small things were what was available to celebrate. A successful repair completed ahead of the expected time. A particularly clear day that allowed a view from the rampart that extended further than usual. The first of the season's wild garlic appearing on the south-facing slope below the wall, which one of the men, a man from the south, who had brought the knowledge of it from his homeland, had introduced into the garrison's cooking several years earlier, and which had, by now, become a tradition. The first garlic of the year marking a kind of informal beginning of spring in the Mile Castle's own calendar. They had their own calendar, in the end, not the official one, not the Roman calendar with its feast days and its magistrates and its references to a city very far from here, but the calendar of the place itself, organized around the local events and the local signs and the small rituals that had accumulated over years of men living in this particular place, on this particular ridge. The arrival of the supply convoy was a date. The first frost was a date. The swallows returning was a date. The day the northern horizon had that particular clarity that meant a spell of good weather was coming. That was a date of sorts, marked by nothing except the awareness of the men who had learned to read it. These small landmarks made the year knowable, divided it into sections that were comprehensible and manageable, that replaced the imperial calendar with something more immediate and more personal, a way of measuring time that was rooted in the actual experience of this specific place, rather than in the administrative requirements of an empire-based 3 weeks travel to the south and then a sea crossing away. In this way, quietly and without anyone deciding to do it, the men of the Mile Castle became people of the Wall and of the North. They were still soldiers of the Roman army, still auxiliaries from the Rhine or Gaul, or wherever the recruitment patterns had sent them. But they were also, more specifically and more intimately, the garrison of this particular mile of stone, keepers of this particular gate, watchers of this particular sky. The place had entered them the way places enter people who stay long enough, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually and thoroughly. The way the cold entered the stone and the moss entered the joints, and the wild garlic came back every spring to the same slope, returning because returning was what it did. The years passed in their careful, unremarkable way. The men who came to the mile castle green and uncertain in the early years of their service became, over time, the experienced ones, the ones who knew where things were kept and how things were done, and who could answer questions without consulting the written records, because the answers had long since moved from the records into themselves, into the easy automatic knowledge of the habituated. Some of them completed their 25 years on the wall, or near it, and received their discharge certificates pressed into bronze, and went south. And whatever happened to them after that is not recorded. Some were transferred to other postings mid-service, sent along the road to the next fort or the next province, and the mile castle absorbed their replacements, with the quiet efficiency of institutions that have been receiving replacements for a long time. Some died in the course of their service from illness or accident, or the slow accumulation of hard living in a cold climate, and the official records noted their deaths in the brief format of the duty register, and the stone of the wall held no particular memory of one individual over another. But the aggregate of all these individual presences, the years and the decades of men living and watching and working in this small square of stone on the long ridge, accumulated in the place in some fashion that is not simply metaphorical. The stones were worn where men's hands had rested on them, and where their feet had crossed them day after day. The threshold of the north gate had a particular polish in its center, the smooth place where centuries of feet had worn the stone to something close to brightness. The wall itself leaned very slightly south at the base of certain sections, not from structural failure, but from the slow, imperceptible compression of the earth under the weight of the stone over the long decades of the garrison's occupation. These were the physical marks of habitation, the traces left by people who had been there for a long time and whose presence had, in the way of all human presence in material places, changed the material just slightly, just enough to be read, if you knew what to look for. The wall is still there, in its present form, in its partially reconstructed form, standing in sections on the ridge in the north of England that the Romans chose for it 2,000 years ago. The ridge is the same ridge. The views to the north and south are recognizably the views the soldiers had, modified by the absence of the forest that the Romans and the centuries after them cleared. But the skyline and the curve of the land and the quality of the light on a clear northern day, that quality is the same. The stones that remain are the same stones, worked by the same hands, and if you stand on a remaining section on a clear morning and look out at the country to the north, the wind that you feel on your face is the same wind, blowing from the same direction across the same long undulation of moorland, and the sky above is the same pale northern sky, and the larks, if you listen, are still there, rising from the heather and singing their long vertical songs into the air above the old stone wall. The orders, in the end, were simply the rhythm of the institution, which was itself the rhythm of the empire, which was itself the rhythm of human civilization's recurring attempt to put lines around things and hold them still. The mile castle received its orders and followed them and sent its reports and waited for the next set, and this continued for as long as the garrison was maintained, which was for most of the period from roughly the 2nd century of the Common Era until sometime in the early 5th, when the central administration of the Western Empire began to come apart, and the pay stopped arriving, and the supply convoys stopped coming, and the men on the wall, one by one and unit by unit, made their own decisions about where to go and what to do next, and went. The wall was not stormed. It was not breached by an enemy force in some decisive battle. It was simply, gradually, vacated, as the circumstances that had created the need for it and the administrative capacity to maintain it dissolved together in the slow unraveling of the late Western Empire. The men left. The stone remained. The wind continued its work on the mortar, and the frost, and the rain, and the long patient hands of the centuries. And the northern country went on being the northern country, exactly as it had always been, exactly as it continues to be. The moor and the ridge and the long views and the particular quality of the light on a clear day from a high place. The way the country seems to breathe when the wind drops and the evening comes in. The way the dark settles over the landscape, not like an ending, but like a rest, a pause, a gathering of stillness before the next morning's light. Somewhere on that ridge, in the foundations of a section of wall that has not been excavated, or in the disturbed earth of a mile castle site that lies under its own slow accumulation of turf and time, there may be more tablets, more letters, more words pressed into thin wood by hands that moved with their own particular weight and their own particular care, more requests for socks, more birthday invitations, more small human things that crossed the sea and the long roads and the millennia, looking for the person they were meant for. We do not need to find them to know they are there. We already know what they say. They say, as all the letters from all the edges of all the worlds have always said, in one form or another, I am here. The place is very wide and very quiet, and sometimes very cold. I think of you often. The light here, at a certain time of evening, is something you would not quite believe. I am well. I am keeping watch. All is as it should be. Sleep now. Let the wall hold you. Let the long quiet of the northern country settle over you like the good dark. The fire is low. The watch is steady. The stars are moving in their old reliable way above the stone. Everything is as it should be. Everything is as it always has been, and always will be. Here at the edge of the world where the maps ran out and the men stayed anyway, and the seasons turned, and the wall endured, and the night was long and peaceful, and full of the sound of the wind across the old stone, which is the sound of nothing happening, which is the sound you are listening for, which is the sound of sleep. There is a kind of quiet that only very old places have. A quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of time. So much time accumulated in one place that it becomes its own kind of sound. A frequency below hearing. Something the body registers as a slowing down, a setting down of whatever it has been carrying. The wall has that quiet. The ridge it stands on has it. The moor on both sides of it has it. It is a quiet that the soldiers who lived there for years learned to inhabit the way you learn to inhabit any deep truth about the world you are living in. First with discomfort at its scale, then with accommodation, then finally with something that is close to ease. The ease of a person who has stopped fighting the largeness of the place and begun to move within it as naturally as the wind moves within it. Let that quiet come to you now. There is nothing required of you. No watch to stand. No gate to check. No dispatch to write. The fire is low and steady in the corner of the stone room, and it will burn for a long while yet. And the walls are thick, and the night outside is doing what the night always does at this latitude in this season, which is to be vast and cold and full of stars, and entirely at peace with its own nature. You are in the barrack room, or you are on the watch, or you are somewhere between the two, in that particular state of the deep night hours where the boundary between watching and sleeping is not quite as clear as it seems in the daytime. The other men are nearby, breathing in their slow and steady way. The stone around you holds the warmth of the day's fire in its deep interior, releasing it slowly, evenly, without hurry. Let your breathing slow. You do not need to think about anything that happened today, or about anything that needs to happen tomorrow. The supply convoy will come when it comes. The dispatch will arrive when it arrives. The orders will come in their own time, and the garrison will receive them and act on them, and the wall will continue to stand on its ridge, as it has stood for generation upon generation, patient and permanent, keeping the watch that no single person can keep alone, the long, slow watch that belongs to the stone itself. The heather is quiet on the moor tonight. The larks are not singing yet. They are sleeping in their own way in the heather, small warm things tucked into the dark, waiting for the moment before dawn when the sky lightens just enough to call them upward, and they will rise, as they always do, with their long spiraling songs, and the day will begin again, full of its own small order and its own small beauty. But that is later. Now is the deep watch. Now is the stone, and the fire, and the long dark, and the slow breath. Now is the time when the wall is most entirely itself, when the night country stretches out on both sides of it in perfect stillness, and the stars turn above it in their old and faithful way. And there is, in the whole wide quarter of the world that the wall can see from its ridge, nothing happening at all except the gentle turning of the earth and the patient endurance of the stone and your own breathing, which is matching, without your having decided it, the long, slow rhythm of the place. You are safe. The wall is holding you. The night is deep and good. Let go of the day. Let go of the plans and the worries and the small tangle of thoughts that the mind makes in the hours before sleep. Let them drift, like smoke through the gap in the barrack room wall, out into the cold air, dispersing into the dark, leaving you lighter, quieter, more yourself. Sleep now, or drift, or let the words become a sound rather than a meaning. A steady low voice like the wind across the wall, like the fire breathing in the hearth, like the stone breathing its slow stone breath in the deep middle of the night. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. The watch is kept, the gate is held. All is well on the long wall at the edge of the old world, and the night is wrapping you in its patient dark, and all you need to do now is let it. The fire burns very low now. The embers glow in their steady way, red, orange, and amber, shifting slightly as the air moves through them in its own slow breathing, cooling and settling. The warmth radiates from the hearthstone in a way that is very gentle and very even, the kind of warmth that asks nothing of you except that you receive it, which requires no effort at all. The stone walls of the barrack room are doing what stone walls do in the deep middle of the night, which is to be still. They are very old, these walls, old in the way that only stone and the things made of stone can be old, with the oldness that does not ask to be understood but simply is, a fact of the world as settled and uncomplicated as the fact of the ground beneath the building or the sky above the ridge. Outside, the moorland is sleeping in its own way. The heather is flat and dark under the stars. The streams are running in their low winter channels, making that soft sound that running water makes at night, a sound that is neither loud nor quiet but simply continuous, a murmur that has been there since long before the wall was built, and will be there long after. It is the sound of the place talking to itself in its own language, which is a language of water and stone and wind and the slow accumulation of time. You are here, in this place, in the good dark. Your breathing is slow. Your body is warm and heavy in a way that is very pleasant. The heaviness of a body that has found its rest and is sinking into it, gratefully, without resistance. The pillow is soft beneath your head, or the cloak is folded just right, or the angle of the stone is comfortable in its own hard way. And it does not matter, because the comfort is not about the surface you are lying on, but about the permission you have given yourself to be still. Let the images come if they will. The wall on its ridge in the morning, the larks rising from the heather, the pale gold of the evening sky above the northern horizon, the fire in the stone room, the hands around the wooden cup, the small sound of the dispatch rider's horse on the stone road, the swallows gathering on the wall top in August, the spring water cold from the limestone, the stars in the deep watch, very numerous, very patient, moving in their old circles above the old stone. Let them drift past you, one by one, without holding any of them, the way the water of the stream drifts past the stone in its bed, touching everything lightly, holding nothing, moving always in the one direction, which is the direction of the sea, which is the direction of rest, which is the direction you are going now, drifting, slowly, on the long, quiet current of the night. The wall holds. The watch continues. The embers breathe. The stars turn. The night is very deep and very wide, and very full of the particular piece of old places that have seen everything and forgotten nothing, and hold it all in their stone without weight or judgment, simply holding, simply being what they are, simply standing on their ridge in the ancient northern light, the way they have always stood and will always stand, stone upon stone, patient, enduring, quiet. Sleep now, my friend. The night is long and good. You are safe here. The day will come in its own time. For now, there is only this. The fire very low, the stone very still, the dark very deep, and somewhere out on the moorland, a single lark already awake, too early, singing to a sky that has not yet begun to lighten, singing because that is what it does, that is what it has always done. That single clear voice rising into the dark above the ancient wall, carrying nothing but itself, needing nothing but the air, just the voice in the dark and the vast and patient night. And you here, safe, drifting, warm, and going now, gently and completely, towards sleep. The light before dawn is not exactly light. It is a quality of the darkness changing, a loosening at the eastern edge of the sky that does not announce itself with any particular drama, but simply shifts, almost imperceptibly, the balance between the dark and the not quite dark. The stars begin to lose their sharpest brightness. The moorland, which has been a single undifferentiated darkness for hours, begins to acquire the faintest suggestion of form, the ridge discernible from the sky above it, the heather barely visible as a texture against the ground. The dawn watch soldier, standing on the rampart or sitting in the gatehouse, feels this change before he sees it. His body, accustomed by years to this hour, registers it as a kind of loosening, a very gentle release of the night's tension, not because the night has been frightening, but because any long holding of stillness, when it ends, brings its own particular quality of ease. The darkness has been held for hours, and now it is being let go, slowly, one shade at a time, and the world is beginning, once again, to become visible. The eastern horizon takes on the first color just before the sun arrives. It is not yet gold, not yet the warm tones of full sunrise. It is something cooler and more tentative, a pale gray green or a very faint rose, a color that exists only in these minutes and nowhere else in the day. The color of the world being very gently reminded that light is possible, that warmth is coming, that the dark was never permanent. And then, somewhere in the heather below the wall, the first lark rises, not with any particular urgency, simply upward, the way larks go, in a long, ascending spiral, its song beginning before it has fully committed to the climb, as if the singing and the rising are not two separate acts, but one continuous act, a single motion of the body and the voice together, ascending into the lightening sky. The watch soldier hears it without surprise. He has heard it before, many times, in many seasons, at the same hour, from the same section of moor. The lark and the dawn watch and the wall have all been here longer than he has, and longer than any of the men who served before him. And the lark's song is part of the morning the way the cold stone under his feet is part of the morning, and the pale sky ahead is part of the morning. All of it adding up to the simple, complete fact of a new day arriving on the old ridge, over the old wall, in the old north. He does not need to do anything about it. He simply needs to be here for it, which he is, which is enough. The day will bring its small requirements, and its small satisfactions, and its unremarkable sequence of tasks, and meals and conversations and watches. The wall will stand on its ridge as it stood yesterday. The north country will be the north country, unhurried and vast. The fire inside will be rebuilt from the night's embers, and the men will rise, and the gate will be opened, and the long ordinary beautiful day will begin. But for one more moment, in the last of the deep night and the first of the not quite dawn, let everything be still. Let the lark sing into the dark sky above the wall. Let the stone be stone, and the cold be cold, and the stars be stars, and the dark be dark, and let the whole wide quiet of the northern world be exactly what it is, which is the oldest and most reliable comfort there is. You are safe. You are warm. The night is ending. Sleep now, deeply, completely, in the good dark, while the lark sings and the stone holds, and the ancient wall stands patient and steady on its ridge, keeping the long watch, waiting for the morning that is always, always, always coming. The morning will come, and it will be ordinary. The fire will be built up, and the porridge will be made, and the gate will be opened, and the duty roster will be consulted, and the wall will be patrolled, and the notes will be written, and the day will proceed in its familiar way along its familiar path, leaving at the end another entry in the duty log, a few lines that record what passed through the gate, and what the weather was and whether anyone was ill. And then the log will be closed, and the fire will be banked, and the watches will turn, and the night will come again, and all will be well. This is what was always waiting for you, here on the edge of the world. Not a great revelation, not a conquest or a mystery or a dramatic unfolding of hidden truth. Just the wall on its ridge and the fire in the stone room, and the long sky above the north country, and the men going about the ordinary business of a day that is much like every other day, and is, in being so, a very good day indeed. The stone is very old, the night is very deep, your breathing is very slow and very even, like the tide, like the seasons, like the long and patient endurance of everything that simply stays where it is, and does what it does, and waits without urgency for whatever comes next. We are in no hurry here. There is nowhere we need to be. The watch is kept. The fire is low. The stone is warm, and the dark is good, and the wall stands on its ridge in the ancient northern night, and the larks are sleeping in the heather, and the stars are turning in their old circles. And somewhere, many miles to the south, the supply convoy is resting for the night, and will continue its way tomorrow, and the road is good, and all is well. All is well. All is always well, here in the quiet. The day will come. You will be ready for it when it does. But that is later. That is the morning. That is the world of tasks and purposes and the familiar shape of a life in motion. Right now, there is only this: the deep rest, the long dark, the old stone, the quiet fire, the enormous northern sky with its patient stars, and somewhere in the heather, a lark sleeping. And you, here, warm and held and safe, going deeper now into the good dark, leaving the watch to the wall, leaving the night to the stone, leaving the world to its own long and faithful endurance. Sleep well, my friend. Sleep well. The wall is keeping watch tonight. The Mile Castle is standing on its ridge. The North Country is being the North Country, vast and quiet and deeply at peace with itself. And you are here, at the edge of it, held in the warmth of the stone and the low fire and the deep dark, going gently and completely, and without effort down into sleep, down into the good rest that the long day, and the long night, and the long wall have been building toward all this time, in the patient way of old places that have learned that everything, given enough time, comes to its rest. Sleep now, deeply, completely. All is well. All is well. All is well.